Okay, think about the United Kingdom. It's a major global player, one of the oldest democracies on the planet, and yet it seems to be missing something pretty fundamental, a written constitution. At least, that's what it looks like on the surface. In this explainer, we're going to dig in and solve this fascinating constitutional puzzle.
I mean, really think about that for a second. The United States has its constitution, right? A single sacred document. Germany has its basic law. Almost every country has one. So the big question we're tackling is, how on earth does the UK pull it off? How does it all work without that one central rulebook? Is it some kind of brilliant, flexible system, or is it just chaos waiting to happen?
All right, let's start solving this mystery. The first thing you need to know is that we're not looking for a single book. Instead, imagine we're putting together the pieces of a giant, ever-changing jigsaw puzzle.
And here it is, the big reveal. The Constitution isn't actually missing at all, it's just uncodified. That's the key word here. It means all the rules, all the principles, all the laws that you'd expect to find in a constitution do exist, they're just not all written down together in one single document. They're spread out across a whole bunch of different sources.
So what are these puzzle pieces? Well, they mainly come in three types. First, you've got Acts of Parliament. These are the actual laws passed by politicians. Then there's what's called common law. This is fascinating. It's law that has been built up bit by bit over centuries from decisions made by judges in court cases. And finally, you have something a little more abstract, constitutional conventions.
So, what in the world is a constitutional convention? Honestly, the best way to think of it is as a kind of political handshake agreement. It's an unwritten rule that isn't technically law, but it's so fundamental to how things are done that everyone in power is just expected to follow it. A perfect example? The monarch has to approve laws passed by Parliament. The last time a monarch said no was way back in 1708. There's no actual law stopping them from refusing today, but by convention, it's just not done.
Okay, so with all these different pieces floating around, laws, court cases, unwritten rules, you're probably wondering, who has the final say? What's the one principle that holds this whole unwritten system together?
This, right here, is the bedrock. It's called parliamentary sovereignty, and it's a huge deal. It basically means that an act of parliament is the highest, most powerful form of law in the United Kingdom. The courts can't strike it down, and no parliament can pass a law that a future parliament can't just undo. This idea was really locked in after big historical showdowns like the Glorious Revolution and the 1689 Bill of Rights, which made it crystal clear that Parliament, not the monarch, was in charge.
But, and you knew there was a but, right? It gets more complicated. Even this core principle is debated. In a really famous court case, a top judge, Lord Hope, actually said that parliamentary sovereignty might not be totally absolute. He suggested that the rule of law itself, the idea that everyone is subject to the law and that the courts uphold it, might be the ultimate controlling factor. This just perfectly shows you the tension and the balance at the heart of the UK system. Even its most fundamental rule is up for discussion.
So here are the three key players in this whole setup. You have Parliament, the supreme lawmaker, you have the executive, which is the government of the day that actually runs the country, and you have the judiciary, the judges and courts who interpret the law. Now, the dynamic here is really different from, say, the US. In the UK, the courts can look at a law from Parliament and say what it means, but they can't turn around and say, nope, this is unconstitutional, it's gone.
Now we're getting to what a lot of people see is the biggest advantage of not having everything written down in one place. Its ability to change and evolve over time without some massive, formal crisis. It's a constitution that's constantly in motion.
You can see this evolution just by looking at history. It's this long story of power slowly shifting. It all starts way back in 1215 with the Magna Carta, which for the first time put some real limits on the king's power. Fast forward to 1689, and the Bill of Rights really cements Parliament's top dog status. Then, over the centuries, power starts shifting more towards the people, like with the 1928 Equal Franchise Act, which finally gave every adult the right to vote. And then, as recently as 1998, we saw a massive change with devolution, and all of this was done through simple acts of Parliament.
Yeah, devolution is a fantastic modern example of this flexibility. Through a few key laws, a huge amount of power over stuff like health and education was handed over from the central government in London to new parliaments and assemblies in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The entire constitutional map of the UK was basically redrawn, all without having to write a brand new constitution.
But this flexible system has been put under some serious pressure recently.
the Brexit referendum in 2016, where 51.9% of voters chose to leave the EU, created this massive constitutional headache. Could the government just trigger the exit process by itself? The Supreme Court had to step in, and it eventually ruled that no, because leaving the EU would change rights that Parliament had granted. Only another act of Parliament could give the government the authority to do it. It was a huge stress test for the system, and it showed it could bend, but it didn't break.
So, all of this brings us to the final, and maybe the most important question of all. With all this complexity and all these unwritten rules, should the UK just finally write it all down?
And you bet there's a huge debate about this. It really comes down to two completely different ways of looking at things. On one side, people who want a written constitution say it would bring some much-needed clarity. Everyone would know exactly what the rules are. They also argue it would protect human rights more strongly and put clearer limits on what the government can and can't do. But on the other side, people say, hold on, the system's greatest strength is that it's flexible and adaptable. They argue it reflects the UK's unique history and allows the Constitution to grow and change with the times, organically.
So when you get right down to it, the UK's constitution isn't some dusty old rulebook sitting on a shelf. It's a living, breathing system. It's like a continuous conversation between Parliament, the courts, and these centuries-old political traditions. And it's constantly being shaped and reshaped by what's happening in the world right now.
Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. In today's world, which is changing so fast, is a constitution that's built on unwritten rules and tradition a source of incredible strength, or is it a dangerous weakness? What do you think? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.